Hi folks, welcome to Try Linux, getting started with Linux desktop operating systems. I'm Evan Williamson, Digital Infrastructure Librarian at University Idaho Library. This is a really fun workshop. Usually we try to do it in person. We go in the lab, we have a bunch of laptops sitting out, a bunch of USB sticks with some distributions on it, and we let you go ahead and play with this operating systems on some real hardware. And so that's really the point of this workshop. And I hope that you have a laptop or a desktop that you want to get started with because you want to go ahead and choose a distribution, burn it onto a USB, and try it on some real hardware so you get a sense of really what it's like to use Linux. So we're trying to give you a big background, some orientation, and really just kind of demystify this operating system, this ecosystem, to invite you in to start being a Linux user yourself. Before we get started, I just kind of wanted to give a little background. I've been a Linux user as my primary desktop for most of my adult life. I didn't get started because I'm some sort of tech guy. In fact, my background is in humanities, but I was on campus. I had free laptops that people were throwing away. They didn't run very well on Windows. They were very, very slow. And so I kind of gradually just kind of learned how to install Ubuntu on it, make it into a really nice, usable computer. And I just kept using it. And so my family all uses Linux. None of them are technical people at all. My kids use it. They don't even know that there's something different, and it's never bothered them. So I think it's a really great operating system. I think it's exciting to go out and try it. And so this workshop is all about inviting you to, become a Linux user for the next half an hour, and making sure that you kind of understand how you would get started and how you could try it out yourself. So this website is going to have a lot of resources on it. There's lots of links on the website, and it'll be there for you to reference in the future. So let's get started here in the introduction section. So as I said, the real aim here is to get started with desktop Linux distribution, trying it out on some real hardware without actually having to install it on that hardware. Along the way, I'm going to really cover a whole bunch of extra material, stuff that you don't need to know. But really the idea there is just to give you this orientation about everything about Linux, to demystify it and invite you in here and to use it as your kind of daily operating system. Honestly, you can skip ahead to all of this. The fun part is downloading your distro, burning it on USB, and then booting it up on some live hardware. But if you're still with me at this point, we're going to keep going here, and I'm going to give you some background. So what is Linux? Linux is a family of open source operating systems that are used to run all kinds of computers, from your laptop all the way up to supercomputers. You might hear something like Unix-like or Nix, since Linux is a part of an operating systems, a group of operating systems that are descended from the early research computing system called Unix. Linus Torvalds was the creator of Linux, and so you can actually go here on the website and listen to him talking or pronouncing it. So an operating system is this package of software that's going to manage and coordinate all the hardware and software on your computer. And it's made out of a few components. This is a very kind of basic summary of it. But you have a bootloader, which is going to start these low-level processes that are necessary to boot your operating system when you press the power button. And so most of the Linux distributions use one that's called grub, and Windows and Mac have their own bootloaders. Then you have a low-level component called the kernel, which is going to manage all that hardware and all the low-level software components and coordinate the operation of your operating system. And this is really what Linux is. On top of that, you're going to have a shell, some way to interact with that core. So there's a text-based command line interface that's pretty typical when you're working with a server or maybe with Raspberry Pi and old style computers when they didn't have a graphical interface. Another kind of shell is a desktop environment, which is a graphical user interface that we're familiar with, the kind of windows that we interact with. And then inside those shells, you're actually going to run applications. So those are those individual programs that you use to achieve the things that you want to do with your computer. So like I said, at the core of Linux is the Linux kernel. and we can actually follow this link here at kernel.org, and you can actually go look at that code. All that code is open source. It's there for you. You could go ahead and download it if you wanted to. You probably don't want to do that because it's very low level and it doesn't make any sense. You want a whole complete operating system. But the kernel itself is developed by the nonprofit organization Linux Foundation, and still managed by the original creator, Linus Torvalds, with contributors from thousands of people around the world. A lot of them are paid by corporations who use Linux and use parts of Linux for their work. And so there's all kinds of people involved in this project. So why might you choose Linux as an operating system? So at its core, Linux is free software, and the free that we're using there is not just about the cost. It's not really about the cost at all. Free in this context means freely and openly licensed. So freedom, like Braveheart might be screaming. This is going to give you very specific freedoms. You can fully control, inspect, modify, copy, and even share the operating system that you install on your system. So this is really different from Windows or from Mac, where these are proprietary operating systems. You don't actually own that operating system that you install on your system. You're only licensing it under the terms of service that they provide to you. And so on a Linux operating system is totally different. You have freedoms that are specifically given to you by the license. Most users, it's not really the most compelling reason to use Linux. That's not why a lot of us get started. Instead, we just appreciate that it's a solid, powerful, and user-friendly operating system. It's got really good performance. It's got good security. It respects your privacy. And of course, there's cost benefits. As I said, most distributions are free and might revive your old computer that is sitting away doing nothing. So in addition to that, there's this great ecosystem of open source applications and services that a lot of developers or just other kinds of users might want to be able to interact with on an easier basis with their desktop. So Linux is actually way more popular than you might think. Most people are familiar with Mac and Windows, but actually Linux is running the majority of computers in the universe, or in the world, on Earth, and in our spaceships, of course. But most of the web is run on Linux servers. So about 95% or more of web servers are running on Linux. So this website that you're looking at here in front of you is being served up from Linux. This YouTube video that you're hopefully watching is served up on a Linux computer. All of the top 500 supercomputers run Linux. The majority of smartphones in the world run Linux. So here's my little Android phone running a version of Linux. Here's a pocketbook reader. This is running another kind of version of Linux. Here's a Chromebook that you may be familiar with. Really great usable operating system that is actually a form of Linux developed by Google. And Internet of Things devices almost all run Linux, and a lot of single board computers, such as the Raspberry Pi, run on Linux. So it's incredibly flexible. It's running on all kinds of different hardware and enables them all with high performance and usability. So if you want to use a virtual machine in the cloud, you want to do some high performance computing, or you just want to tinker with the Raspberry Pi at home, it can be really helpful to get familiar with this ecosystem and to understand and know about how to use Linux. So the idea here, there's lots of practical reasons why you might be interested. There's lots of ideological reasons why you might be interested, but it's also just a really great everyday desktop operating system for your personal computer. So let's go and figure out what kind of distribution that you actually want to use on this next tab here. So I've been saying Linux as if it's a thing, but that's, as I said, Linux really is this low-level component, the kernel. And so what you want is a complete operating system that has some software that you can use and a desktop that you can interact with. And so those in Linux are shipped as a complete package of all these components, and it's called the distribution, or more commonly just called a distro. So there's these low-level technical stuff, your desktop environment, all these default applications that come bundled all together. And really, there's hundreds of distros that you can choose from. They're maintained by organizations, maybe enterprise organizations like Canonical or Red Hat, or internal organizations like Google has their own distribution that is used by their developers. They can be maintained by a community of people who have a philosophy around a certain way that they want to build their operating system, maybe a language that they want to support, maybe educational aim that they're trying to build, or they can even be maintained by a single individual who is interested in some particular respin of a distribution, and they put it out there for other people to use. So each distribution has its own kind of philosophy, it's going to have its own strengths and its own kind of use cases that shape what is put into that. So the unique thing there is that most of us are not going to buy a computer that has a Linux distribution already put on it. So instead, we got to go and choose it on our own and install it onto our system. And that's actually kind of exciting. It's also, can be overwhelming. But if you're excited about the idea of choosing and evaluating all these different options, go over to this website called Distro Watch, which has for many years just kind of gathered all of the release information about all of the distributions and provides a lot of really great kind of reference for all the different distributions that are out there. And you can kind of just scroll through recent releases, and you can scroll through the things that people are searching for. And there's hundreds of distributions on there that you'll probably never want to use or be interested in using. But it's really fun just to go and see what people are creating out there and what they're using. So if you just want a quick suggestion and you want to skip this section, just choose Ubuntu Desktop. This is the most popular desktop Linux distribution in the world, which means that there's a huge user community and there's lots of help available. It's very, very usable. It's very beginner friendly. And when you search on the web for help about any problem, the majority of the responses that you're going to get relate to Ubuntu. So it really is the easiest distribution to adopt if you just want to have a seamless, easy approach to it. So that's my quick suggestion. But now I'm going to give you a much more long and detailed set of considerations on what you want to think about when you're choosing your distribution. So as I said, it can be very overwhelming. I created a list of kind of the major distribution families that you can go through and scroll through to get some other ideas and lots of links. And one thing just to know about that is that there's kind of major families that are all interrelated. And so there's the Debian family, which is one of the oldest active Linux distributions, and Ubuntu is actually part of that family. And then there's a whole bunch of other distributions that are based on Ubuntu so that they can kind of build on that core and do their own little customizations and their different philosophies based on that solid core that Ubuntu is providing. So Canonical is a enterprise software company, and they manage Ubuntu. Likewise, the other major family is Fedora, which is managed by a giant open source enterprise company in America called Red Hat. And the other big one is SUSE, which is a huge open source company in Germany. So those are kind of the big players out there. But here's some aspects that you might want to think about when you're going and choosing your distribution. So all distributions kind of have a community around them and a philosophy that's inspiring them. And so do you want to just be able to search and find all the answers to your questions? That might be Ubuntu. You might want to be part of a values-driven community around open source, and that might be more like Fedora. Or do you want to get involved in this very deeply invested group of enthusiasts, and that might be Arch Linux. So do you want everything to just work, or are you willing to spend a whole bunch of time customizing it? Each of the communities and philosophies of the distro is going to really impact that out of the box experience and how much help is available out there. In general, like I said, Ubuntu is the largest user group, so there's lots and lots of help out there. However, there is a lot of other communities that are very active in forums and wikis and have really great documentation that invite people to get involved in the distribution. So, look for the community out there that you're interested in being involved in. The other thing that I would say in there is that if you're already using a server at work or in some other kind of project, like on a Raspberry Pi, choose a distro that's in the same family, because it's really going to help make your life easier, because you're going to get more familiar with that one kind of ecosystem. Repositories and software. So each of the distros is going to offer a repository that's used to manage and update all of the software that's part of that operating system, and also just more software that you might want to install to use on your desktop. Some of the distros have really huge vetted and stable applications like Debian, and so there's all kinds of things available, but they keep it back, they keep it very stable, so it's not the most up-to-date, it's not the most exciting software in the world. Others are much more cutting edge, much more up-to-date, like Fedora, and others invite a lot more community packages to be in it. So you have to kind of look a little bit more carefully about what those packages are, but there's lots of stuff available. Some distributions are packaged only with free software, so they might have a requirement that it is free and open and meets their community guidelines, but others will just include everything that you really want to use, but even if it's not free. So for example, MP3s and DVD encodings are proprietary software that you might not realize, but Ubuntu has that in their repositories, which makes it easy to install, as most people want to do. But some repositories aren't going to contain that because it's not free and openly licensed. The other big consideration is what kind of release type that you want. Do you want it to be a very stable operating system that you're just going to be using without having to upgrade it for a very long period of time? Or do you always want to be on the cutting edge? Do you want the latest and greatest tech coming out there? So there's usually two types of release schedules. There's a rolling release or a fixed release. So rolling release distros have a continuous stream of updates. You're always getting the latest software. You never have to upgrade to a new version, but you always might encounter some instability. These ones usually have some sort of tool to roll back if something goes wrong. You run an update and all of a sudden your keyboard doesn't work. So there's always going to be some way to roll it back and get you back to a stable working version. The other more traditional approach is a fixed release, where there's stable incremental versions that might require you to do a major upgrade every so often. So fixed releases are usually broken into the latest and LTS, long-term support versions. So if you just want to install it one time, go ahead and look for that LTS version. So Ubuntu, for example, has their normal releases are only supported for 9 months, but the LTS are guaranteed support for at least 5 years. So LTS is a really great option if you just kind of want to install it and just leave that running, and it's stable and solid for a very long time. One of the other considerations is your hardware. So as I said, the strength of Linux is that it's so flexible, it can run on all kinds of hardware, from your Raspberry Pi to your supercomputer. Likewise, it's probably going to run on any desktop or laptop computer that you have, with all of that support just directly baked into the kernel. You don't have to go tracing down weird drivers and putting them in from CD-ROMs like you used to have to do on Windows. However, if you want to get the best experience with your particular hardware, you want to look for a distro that's suited to it and aimed for it. So if you have a very old computer that's already being bogged down by Windows, there's a lot of lightweight distributions that are specifically designed to revive that kind of hardware. You're not going to have a great experience if you put on the most up-to-date modern desktop onto it, because it's going to be too heavy for that old computer. If you have a brand new laptop, on the other hand, you want to look for a distro that has the most up-to-date kernel, because you want to have the full support for all the advanced features of your fancy CPU and all of the cool features that you have on there, like a touchscreen and so on. So the best performance is going to be on the newest kernels. Also, if you have like a graphics card, you might want to look for the distro that specifically says that they support it, because some of those graphic cards can be a little bit complicated to get the installed and working correctly. Most of them will work okay out of the box, but unless you have the proprietary drivers to actually run it, it's not going to get it to its full potential. Final thing that you might want to think about are what the installer that you're actually going to use to install this Linux distribution offers to you. So one of the big barriers to adopting Linux in the past was just that it was really complicated to install. People aren't used to installing their own operating system. When you buy your Windows and your Mac computer, it's installed there already. You don't have to do that. But Ubuntu came out with an installer that was just very friendly and visual. And so there's still some installers that are like that are just help you and walk you through the process. And there's others that aren't so friendly. So Ubuntu, I think, is still a really good installer that gives you a lot of options. If you have a newer computer, it's probably going to have Secure Boot as a feature, which is good. But it's only supported on the bigger Linux distributions that can afford to have the signed certificate that's necessary to tell Secure Boot that this is an okay piece of software to run. If you are looking at a smaller distribution, it's not going to automatically support Secure Boot. So that might be something that you think about. If you want to keep using Windows alongside Linux, that works pretty well. You can actually just partition your hard drive into two parts. You keep Windows working in one, you install Linux on the other half, and you can coexist very happily. And so some of the installers are going to make that really easy, and Ubuntu is the main one that does that. It's just it automatically realizes that you have Windows already installed on this computer, and it says, hey, do you want a dual boot? And you click one button and it works. You can do that with any installer, but it might be a lot more work to figure out how to do it correctly with the non-Ubuntu installer that's a little bit less friendly. And then the other thing that you might want to think about is disk encryption. So most of the newer distros will support a full disk encryption to keep your hard drive data safe, and that'll be an option during the install. If you set that up, you'll basically have another password that unlocks the encryption on your disk. Every time you reboot your system, you're going to have to provide that password and then separately log into your account. So if that's something that's interesting to you, make sure that you look for that option as available in your distribution. So that's the very long-winded considerations that you might think about as you're choosing your distribution. But once you've gone through all of that, you still have at least one more choice. And so unlike Windows and Mac or Chromebook, Linux desktops are actually kind of separate from the core, and you can install them independently. So after you've chosen your distribution, you'll still actually probably have a choice of a desktop environment, which is that graphical interface, these windows that we interact with. So most of the distros will actually provide a whole set of different pre-bundled desktop environments so you'll have more than one option. The most common ones are GNOME, KDE, and XFCE. And so most distros will actually have all three of those. And each of the distributions often will sort of tweak those desktops. So the final look, the default softwares that ship with it will vary quite a bit between the different distributions. So go ahead and you take a look at the screenshots that they have on their website, and you just kind of pick the ones that you're interested in trying. So in that desktop environment is another set of choices. You want to think about, how heavy is this desktop? The newer, slicker desktops on GNOME and KDE require quite a bit of resources to run it. So you want to have a modern, nice laptop to run it well. If you have an old computer and you have low specs, you don't want to choose one of those. You want to go for a light desktop like XFCE or LXQT. So there's options out there. how configurable do you want that desktop to be? Do you want to spend a lot of time tweaking look and feel, or do you just want it to look good out of the box? Most people kind of consider GNOME just something that out of the box, it looks how it's going to look and it looks great. KDE is one where people have spent, there's all kinds of configuration options, and they spend a lot of time getting it to look the way they want and function in the way that they want. Do you want to have a very unique kind of desktop, or do you want that kind of traditional Windows 7 look and feel? So GNOME is definitely a different kind of look that's pretty unique. But if you're nostalgic for Windows 7, check out Cinnamon, which is on Linux Mint, or some of the other more traditional desktops. So there's a list of those also in the resources that you can go ahead and check out. And there's kind of families of these desktops as well. The last thing I just want to mention is that you actually can buy Linux pre-installed on computers. It's much more common in recent years. And so in particular, Dell and Lenovo have a lot of models now that have Linux pre-installed. Dell installs Ubuntu, and Lenovo, I believe, gives you a choice of Fedora or Ubuntu. There's also some Linux-specific companies, such as System 76, based in Colorado, which are really doing good business right now. And so having more and more manufacturers offering Linux-specific devices means that better hardware support is actually being built into the kernel, which is really great for everyone. So if you're looking to buy a PC that you might want to install Linux on, look for these ones that are similar to the models that Dell and Lenovo are already offering, using some of the same components, because that stuff is going to be really well supported in the distributions. So all of that stuff in mind, we're going to pretend that we've now decided on exactly what distribution we want to use, and we're going to go ahead and try one out. So pop over to this next tab, Try, and we'll try to walk through this process right now. So the steps are basically that you're going to have to download the ISO image for your distribution of choice. You're going to burn that onto a USB stick, and then you're going to boot that up on your live hardware. And you're going to be able to do that without actually having to install anything or change anything on that hard drive. You're still going to be able to test it out on that real hardware. So step number one is to download your distribution. And so most modern desktop distributions are actually distributed as an ISO disk image, which we call live USB or a live CD, meaning that it can actually be booted from that installed media. Traditionally, it was on a CD or a DVD, but now most computers don't have an optical drive, so you're going to use USB instead. So you surf over to your distribution's download page to go find that ISO. So I guess actually I will go back over here to Ubuntu to find the download. And you're going to see here's, we're at the Ubuntu site. Canonical is the corporation that runs it. And you're going to see that there's these different kinds of options. There's this cloud, IoT, Raspberry Pi, server, and desktop. And we want to use the desktop version. And so download Ubuntu Desktop, and you're going to see that there's a LTS version right here, 20.04.2 LTS. So that's that very long term supported one that says that at least until April 2025. And you can just click the download button and get your version. The more recent version is Ubuntu 2010. And so if you want to go with the cutting edge, you can choose that. On some distributions, they'll actually have one more choice that you have to make there because they'll support 64-bit architecture, 34-bit or 32-bit architecture, or ARM. So you might see one of these options here, although most of the 32-bit support is being phased out. But if you have a legacy computer that needs 32-bit, which is pretty rare at this point in time, you can go look for that. But if you don't know, you probably have a 64-bit computer and you just want to grab that option. Once you click that download button, it is going to take quite a while to download because your ISO is usually around 2 to 6 gigs. So you're going to wait for that to download. I've already downloaded it. I'm going to stop my share here. So I'm going to share my full screen now. And you can see that I have my Ubuntu 2010 desktop 64 ISO already downloaded on my computer, and it's 2.9 gigs. So those ISOs are a exact binary copy. It's an image of a storage device. You can't just copy that over onto your USB and expect it to work. Instead, you actually have to burn it to make that image actually overwrite the existing file system on your USB and just replace it, removing whatever was already there. So the first thing you're going to need to do is get yourself your fancy USB stick that you want to use. It has to be bigger than that ISO that you downloaded, obviously. So if we have one that's 2.9 gigs, we need at least probably a 4 gig USB stick for it to work. In general, your average 8 gig is basically what you need. Pretty much any USB stick will work, but there is a pretty significant difference between the write and read speeds on different qualities of your USB sticks. So get a halfway decent one. This is a Lexar, and I've used it for many years and installed Linux off of this USB onto numerous computers over the years. So, having one that's a little bit newer, has those USB 3 speeds, helps the whole process go a little bit faster and a little bit more stable. The second thing you're going to need is a disk imaging utility of some type. And so I suggest Etcher as a really great utility. This is just very usable. It just seems to work, and it also has very sane defaults so that you don't accidentally overwrite your whole computer. And so I really would suggest Etcher for any platform. You're just going to go over to their website. There'll be a download button here for your operating system, Windows, Mac, and Linux. You're going to download that. You'll get a zip file, and inside that zip file is going to be either an installer or a standalone application exe executable. So download Etcher and have that ready on your system, and we're going to use that to take that ISO and burn it onto your USB. So to get started with that, I'm going to go through this burning the image. So I have my USB stick. It's going to go get plugged into a USB port down here. All right. Now I'm going to go over to my Etcher and open that up. And this is what the application looks like. There's a couple options here. We want to choose that ISO that we just downloaded. So we want to flash from file and go over to my downloads. I have this Ubuntu ISO, and I'm going to open that. And you're going to see that I have only one USB stick plugged into my system right now. So it's automatically chosen that as the target that I want to burn this image onto. So it won't let you apply this onto your own hard drive and mess everything up, and it's pretty smart about choosing the correct USB. If you have more than one USB plugged in at the same time, it'll have a choice here. But I only have one, it's 8 gigs, so I'm pretty sure that that's the right drive. And then finally, we have a nice friendly flash button, which means start that process. So I'm going to click that flash, and you can see that it's going to require some authentication to allow me to do that flash, because I'm going to be actually changing a file system. And so your system may require that as well. Now this process is going to take a long time. It has to byte by byte copy that image over onto the USB stick. And so this flashing process is going to take quite a long time to complete, depending on how fast your system is and how fast your USB stick is. And so this part is just sit back and wait. Maybe you want to use Linux to read a book. So after it finishes with the flashing process, it's going to automatically start validating that flash to make sure that all of that binary data that it's written onto that flash drive is correct. So that just helps ensure the integrity of this whole process. Okay, it looks like our validation was successful and our flash is complete. And so you can go ahead and safely unplug your USB stick, which is now a distro testing and installing machine. So we can close Etcher up um, and get back to the outline here. One thing to keep in mind, once you've written your distribution onto this USB, Mac and Windows will no longer be able to read it since it's formatted as a Linux file system. So once you're done with this process, you're probably going to want to restore that drive to its normal state. You can try using the internal format this drive tools, and a lot of times it might not work. It might not get back to its full size, but you can use this official SD formatter on Windows, which will restore the full drive successfully. So now we want to actually start trying something out on our laptops. And so before you do that, it's a good moment to take stock and back up everything on your computer. You should, in general, be backing up all your files on external storage, maybe in a cloud storage provider as well, to make sure that you have all the things that you really want to save saved in multiple locations so you can recover them if something goes wrong with your computer. You should do that anyway, not just when you're trying out Linux, but make sure that you do that before you start this process. On Windows, another good thing to do is to create a Windows recovery drive on a USB stick. If you search into your settings, you'll find the options to create that. It's basically the same sort of thing. It's going to burn an image onto the USB that is your complete Windows install that can be used to reinstall or to repair your Windows installation if that ever becomes necessary. Mac has a similar system in the Mac OS recovery. So if you haven't done that yet and you haven't been backing up your stuff, before you take this next step with messing around with our live USB, go ahead and take these best practices and get them set up for yourself. So we have chosen our distro, we've downloaded it, we've burnt it onto our USB. Now we get to the fun part, which is booting that onto your computer. To do that, you have to tell your computer that you want to boot from the USB rather than from the default drive where your normal operating system is installed. And so for most systems, you can't just plug your USB in and have it do that. So you're going to have to intervene as your computer first starts up and tell it what you want. So that initial boot process is actually controlled by your BIOS or your UEFI that is installed by your computer manufacturer. And every company is creating slightly different firmware and a different interface for that. So there's a lot of variation on how this works and how you can interrupt that normal startup. So you might need to experiment a little and maybe search around on Google for some advice on how to get this to work. But the first thing is we need to interrupt that startup. And so you want to get your system fully shut down. You can't let it hibernate or suspend. You need to actually get that fully shut down state. And then you're going to go and plug your USB into the system. So I have a HP Envy laptop here as my test subject. I have my distro on my USB stick here, and I'm just going to plug it into one of the USB ports. It doesn't typically matter which USB port you use, although there is some laptops where one of the USB ports is hot and the other ones are not. And so you may, if you're running into issues, want to experiment with a different USB port. Once you have your USB in there, you're just going to go ahead and press the power button and then watch very closely as your computer starts to boot up. Every device is different, like I said, but when it starts to boot, you're going to see usually the manufacturer's logo flash on the screen, and then probably some message down in the lower corner of the screen, maybe like right here or right here, and sometimes in the middle, that tells you how to interrupt that boot process or that startup process. And it'll say something like, press this key to interrupt the boot process, or press this key to enter BIOS, or press this key to choose a boot device. And often it's going to flash by so quickly that there's no possible way that you could read it. And so you kind of have to be able to guess. The interrupt key is usually going to be delete, sort of this top row of your keyboard. Delete, escape, it'll be F12, F11, F10, F2, F1, F9 are the most common interrupt keys. Sometimes it's just enter also. So it totally depends on the manufacturer. Sometimes even within the manufacturer, it's different. It's just on the model. And then the other complication might be that some laptops, you actually have to use the function key to access the interrupt key. So you may need to experiment. You may need to search on Google to find the combination that works for you. And if you are doing your experimenting and you just press your power button and then Windows starts booting up, before Windows boots, just hold the power button down and that'll force it to shut down again, and then you can try again and again. On older Macs, you can just hold down the Option key and that should start the startup manager, which will allow you to select your USB drive. If you already have Linux installed, when you boot it up, sometimes you'll get over to the grub boot menu and you'll just use the arrow keys to select system startup, and that should get you into the BIOS as well. So I'm going to show you what it looks like on, or try to show you what it looks like on this HP. And I believe that the interrupt key on this is escape. And so I have my USB in here. I press the power button and it starts up, and I'm going to press escape to try to interrupt the boot process. And there we go. So I interrupted the boot process. It didn't boot into Windows. Instead, I'm getting this menu here of options that I can do choose rather than the normal boot process. And so in this case, it's saying the startup menu. Then it says I can have a series of choices of what I'd like to do. But in this case, what I want to do is F9, um, which is the boot device options. So I'm going to show that one more time up close. So I have this little menu here that's come up because I interrupted the boot process by pressing escape. And so now I can press F9 in order to see the boot device options. So I'm going to do F9, and you're going to see that it comes up with another menu in the BIOS, which is my boot device manager. And it's going to give me the choice of all the different drives that this system can detect. And you're just going to scroll down to the USB drive, which you're going to recognize because it matches the device that you've plugged in. And so I have one that says USB hard drive device Lexar, which is what I've plugged in here. And so I'm going to just go ahead and press enter on that boot option. And we're going to get another little menu, in this case, very tiny because of this strange monitor resolution. And it's going to give me these options that say Ubuntu, Ubuntu Safe Graphics, and then some other stuff. But this is now the menu coming off of that USB stick that's going to let me boot into Ubuntu, not to install it or not installing it, just to boot into our live distribution session, which is just running off this USB stick. It's not installing anything directly on this hard drive. It's not messing anything up on this device until I ask it to. So if I press return, it's going to start booting up on the system from that USB drive into a live session. And you're going to see startup stuff coming on. It's saying Ubuntu down here. It's going to take a little while because it has to read all of the data off of the USB and get that into memory in order to boot into the full live distribution. And so it's just giving me, it's checking this disk to make sure everything is valid and not corrupted. So that's another step on the process. And it's going to take a little bit of time for it to do that because, again, it's doing that on the USB stick rather than on a hard drive, which would be considerably faster. Okay, so now all of the file checks have finished, and it is now trying to boot up into the main desktop. And so there we are. We're running Ubuntu Linux on this system from that USB. Again, we haven't installed anything onto the hard drive of the system, so whatever was installed on here before is perfectly safe and sound, and we can start just using it. So this one, you can see, has an application here that's kind of like a welcome screen, has information, and it gives me the options of directly installing it onto my hard drive or to try Ubuntu. So I'm going to say to try, and it will just let me start messing around with it. and that's going to finish booting it up into that live session, which you can see here. So this is Ubuntu, again, running on that USB. And now I can just start using it. This is just like it would be if you had installed it directly on your system. It's not going to be quite as fast because your USB has not as good performance as a regular hard drive. But you can start opening your applications. You can connect to the internet, surf the web, just start really testing this out and seeing how it works, what it feels like, how well it supports this particular hardware on your system. So I'm going to go back to sharing the outline here. So we figured out on this HP how to interrupt that boot process, which in this case was the escape key. That got us to the menu, which let us choose the boot device, which was that USB that we wanted to boot up from. Now this part, again, is pretty complicated. I'm going to let you read through this to see if you end up running into some problems. As you can see with that HP, it can go very smoothly. It just works. That escape key works. We have a boot choice, and so there's a nice menu to get it started and just get working with it. Not all BIOS and UEFI systems are as friendly and nice to use, and so there's a lot of different sort of tweaks and solutions that you might have to try in order to get it to work. And every vendor is different, and a lot of the different models can be different too, depending on how customized the hardware is inside of it. So I hope that you've managed to get through that whole process, and now you can go ahead and enjoy playing around with that live session. Everything should be there, and you can just start using it. So there's a lot more notes here on this try page about different things that might come up, and how some possible solutions for getting it to work. So with this session booted, you're now a Linux user officially. As I said, the performance of that live session is not going to be as good as having it actually installed on your hardware, but it will give you a really good idea of how well it works with your hardware. It's not going to have all of the advanced drivers for like your CPU or your video card and maybe other specialized features installed and loaded in the system at that point, but everything should work. It might just work a little bit better on a full install. You can open up the applications, you can switch between your workspaces and connect to the internet, browse through the software center just to see what sort of things this distribution offers. It'll also obviously have an app on there that offers to install it on your machine. And most of those installers are very user-friendly at this point. They're graphical. They're going to walk you through that process through a set of visual steps. And it's mainly just clicking a few buttons, filling in a little bit of details, and then a lot of waiting around while it does a whole bunch of writing of files onto your system. You can click through this tutorial from Ubuntu that kind of shows you what that process might look like. Once you're in there, I think what you're going to realize is that, it looks pretty familiar. If you've used computer before, almost everything is in the same kind of idiom. There's not a big change from Linux to Windows and Mac. But there's a few things that you will want to keep in mind. On Linux, user accounts and passwords are much more on the surface than they are with Windows. You're always going to be logged in as a user, and there's going to be a requirement to give your password when you make any changes to the system, such as installing some software or writing over the USB with that disk imager. A lot of that's hidden with Windows and maybe is just replaced with clicking yes. For the file system, Linux is using a file system that Windows doesn't read, and it's presented in a slightly different way. So on Windows, you typically just work in your My Documents folder and those kind of user folders. If you want to go and look at the root on Windows, it's called C drive, and everything comes out of there. Um, Linux is actually going to present all the drives as a unified file system. So if you have on Windows, the C drive and the S drive and all these other kinds of drives with letter numbers. Linux just presents them all um, as if they're one file system, and they start at slash, which is your root. And you're going to have a user directory in a folder called slash home slash username, and it uses slash just like a web address, whereas Windows is using a backslash in their file paths. The other thing that is a little bit unexpected if you're coming from Windows is just how much updates there is with Linux. There's constantly pushing up security and bug fixes and all kinds of updates to your system, but they're much less of a hassle. You don't get that, I'm trying to do something and then Windows goes and does updates for a half an hour without your choice. And so they're very common, but they don't disrupt your work that you're trying to do. And the updates will cover the whole operating system, but also any applications that you've installed using the official repositories or packaging systems. And so this is really helpful. It's keeping everything up to date and more secure by having all of those pushed constantly and having all of your software updated as a group, rather than having to remember to go and update all of these applications separately as you do on Windows. There's usually going to be in your distribution a updater application that automatically runs and tells you, prompts you when you should be running the updater, but occasionally some distros you might have to do that manually. Because of the repository of software, most distributions will have a software center application, which lets you kind of navigate that catalog of software that you can install from the repositories. And so in a visual way, you'll be able to just manage and install software that's curated in that repository. There's also a lot of independent application packaging frameworks that are emerging right now that can supplement that with some other more up-to-date applications, or in some cases even replace the repository. And so there's kind of a few main frameworks right now. Snap, which is kind of led by Ubuntu, Flatpak, and AppImage. And so the idea there is that they simplify the distribution of the software. Each one of these packages has all the dependencies self-contained with it, and usually they're sandboxed so that there's some greater security involved with installing these. There's also going to be a set of applications that come installed by default with every distro, just like you'll have on Windows and Mac. The choices are going to be new if you haven't been in the Linux ecosystem. And so if you check in the resources, there's a list of the common applications that you might encounter. Personally, I found that for my work, when we use Office 360, that's all just in the browser. And so I don't use a lot of the Office type applications on the desktop, which used to be kind of a barrier. If people wanted to use Microsoft Word specifically, that does not run on Linux. You can use it on Office 360 on the web, but there is lots of Office software that's available that's open source for you to use. And finally, on Linux, the terminal is very powerful, and you can use it to do all kinds of fun and interesting things. You don't have to, but it is there, and it's certainly a little bit more usable than Windows command line or PowerShell. So overall, I think that it's not as hard as you might think to adopt using Linux desktop. So, once you have that booted up and the live system running, just give it a good exploration and see how it works for you. I hope that you'll get excited and maybe try it out on your old laptop uh, or on one of your new laptops, or maybe you're even excited enough to go out and buy a Linux specific laptop. So let me know how it goes, and I wish you some success and enjoy.